Are there any topics that are off limits?
Well, I am really sick of talking about Vampirella. And
Oh.
I'm really tired of talking about Wonder Woman.
And why are you sick of talking about Wonder Woman?
Because that's all anybody wants to talk about. And it's something that I did in 1986, and I have done so much more since then. Wonder Woman is a very minor thing that I did.
I mean, you only did 4 issues, yeah. But I did really enjoy them.
Thank you.
But can I ask, I know you don't want to talk about your work on Wonder Woman. Can I ask you about a quote you said about Wonder Woman? Is that okay?
Sure.
Well, you said, you were talking about Promethea, the Alan Moore comic.
Yeah, I really liked that. I got the feeling that she could easily have been, if they redid Wonder Woman the right way, that would have been Promethea.
And I believe they actually published a letter where you said that Promethea was what Wonder Woman could have been if she wasn't ruined by a generation of idiots.
She was ruined by a generation of idiots, yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, when the guys, first of all, I don't think any of the guys most of the guys, I take that back because a couple of them have been good, but most of the ones who wrote and drew her not only didn't understand her, but didn't even like her. I think they were very threatened by this extremely strong woman, and I think that in some cases they actually attempted to disempower her, which is what Denny O'Neil did in the late 60s when he put her into that white catsuit and took away her powers, and all of a sudden she's being taught by a little blind Chinese guy, which, as far as I'm concerned, was also extremely racist. I mean, what name does Denny give him? I Ching, please, But that's only one example. I mean, think of what Mike Deodato did, when he got hold of her. Was just so insulting. I mean, that was Wonder Woman at her worst.
And so was it the art style, or was it also the way it was written?
Everything, both. The way it was written and the art style. These guys, like I said, they didn't like her. They were afraid of her. They were threatened by her.
So with your art style, is there something that you saw in the way that men drew superheroes or drew comics in general?
Well, in the 90s especially. The 90s was the lowest point. As far as I'm concerned, 90s was comics' lowest point in the 20th and 21st century so far. I mean, they were doing women, as these really grotesque, hypersexualized pinups. They had never looked at real women or the way real women dress. Fighting crime and spike-heeled shoes, and there was nothing out there. Not just nothing out there for girls and women, nothing out there for kids. Suddenly everything was grim and gritty and nasty and dark. It was a horrible, horrible period for comics.
So you don't want to talk about Vampirella or Wonder Woman?
I'm so tired of it.
Yeah?
I mean, all I did with Vampirella was just describe her costume over the phone to Frank Frazetta. That's it. That's all I did. And, people mistakenly say I created her, and it totally, I don't like to take credit for something I didn't do.
I've also heard you criticize the work of Robert Crumb.
Well,
do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, in their 60s and through the 70s and 80s. I know he doesn't do that anymore, and he's a very, very good artist. But in those days, he influenced an awful lot of guys with his comics that depicted things like rape and murder and mutilation of women as being something funny. And it isn't funny. Rape isn't funny.
So growing up, comics were dominated by men when you were, in the 40s, 50s. Is there something that you felt that you wanted to bring to the table that you hadn't seen in other artists, like the way they drew?
Well, the thing is that comics, it is true that by the 50s, which is pretty much when I was reading comics were dominated by men, but they were putting out tons of comics for girls that were aimed at girls, and the girls loved to read all those teen comics published by Timely, Patsy Walker, Millie the Model, all the others, and at Archie, Katie Keene, which, I know more recently than that, a lot of women grew up on Betty and Veronica, but Katie Keene was better than Betty and Veronica, She was never fighting over some guy. She was the star. And there were also romance comics, which when I look back at them, they're totally bizarre and wacky, but they're also gorgeously drawn, beautifully drawn.
And so, were there any particular artists that you were influenced by when you were growing up?
Yes, Wally Wood, who I loved the way he drew women, and I used to, there's this thing you can do, and I used to do it. You take a candle, an ordinary candle, and you rub it on a piece of paper, to cover the piece of paper with wax. Then you put the piece of paper over your drawing, over the drawing on a comic book, and you smooth it all down. And when you lift it up, when you peel it up, you've got the drawing, the comic book drawing.
Interesting. I didn't know you could do that.
I used to do that like in order to save the work separately from comic books. I would do that with Wally Wood's the women he did, who I thought were gorgeous. Another one was Matt Baker.
Okay.
Matt Baker, again, he drew such beautiful women, and he drew characters. Fiction House published not just more comics by women, but more comics starring women in the starring role, where they were the heroines, the courageous women, and didn't need some guy to rescue him. Then they weren't just the girlfriends. And he drew a lot of those comics.
So, is it true that you're the first artist to depict a lesbian in comics? Is that true?
Yeah, yes, I was. At the time, I didn't know it. I just wanted to tell the story of Sandy, who had been my roommate. I wanted to tell her story. I wasn't thinking in terms of firsts, I'm doing a first. You don't think of that when you do it.
So, do you want to tell us about this graphic novel that you've got here? Let's talk about that. That's really interesting.
My father came to America at the age of 16, and he came from a little village in what is now Belarus, but what at the time was Russia, because it was all Russia. Yeah.
Okay.
And he spoke Russian and Yiddish. Yiddish was the language they spoke in his country, in his little village. But he came to America, and he went to night school and spoke excellent English, and read tons of books in English. Was very well read. But he was a writer, but he could only write in Yiddish because it was his original language. And in those days, there were Yiddish language newspapers in New York where he lived. So he wrote for the Yiddish language newspapers, and he also wrote a book in Yiddish. So I figured, okay, this book is lost. What could be more obscure, than a book in Yiddish? But we found it on the internet, because you can find anything on the internet. And I had it translated. And I read the translation, and I went, my God, this is just made to be adapted into a graphic novel. So that's what I did. They're all short stories. So I took 12 of them, and I found a different artist for each story. And they did a beautiful job. It was wonderful, because they did such a great job on the stories. I'm so happy with it. It was nominated for an Eisner, which, as you know, is the Oscars of the comic world. So even though it didn't win, being nominated for an Eisner is a kind of cool thing,
Absolutely. You've got our copy. We're looking forward to reading it.
Good, great. Do you have it with you so I can sign it?
Actually, yeah, she got her copy, and you've already signed it, yeah?
Great.
I got one more question before we go. What is your secret to staying young?
Well, I am in good, I have to say I'm in pretty decent shape for my age. I take dance lessons twice a week, and I have been dancing, forever, really. And I don't intend to ever stop, because the minute I stop dancing, I'll probably fall apart completely.
Right, well,
It also helps, really does help, to not have ever smoked, and to never drink more than a glass of wine at dinner or a party or something. And I can't even finish a whole glass of wine.
There you go. Words to live by, folks. Thank you so much for the interview. It was nice meeting you.
And you got me to talk about stuff I didn't want to talk about.
I know. I was kind of sneaky, but it worked.
Yes.